And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're receiving this information. My name is Rafael Vasquez Guzman, and this is your show, Líderes del Futuro. We are on KBBF Bilingual Radio, 89.1 FM, Fort Northern California, and we are on kbbf.org anywhere in the country. We are there on Thursdays from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. California time. And today we have the privilege and opportunity to receive Professor Rafael Martinez, who is communicating with us today about his most recent book, Illegalized, Undocumented Youth Movements in the United States. Professor Martinez, thank you for taking the time and being here with us in our show, Líderes del Futuro.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be on.
And when I say you are a professor, can you give us a little bit of a background on who Rafael Martinez is?
Yes, well, I think I became a professor because one of the things that I had really the opportunity was to, I feel like always had really good mentorship, really good role models. And luckily, people from within my own community that I always latched onto from middle school all the way to, college and beyond. And, when I saw my professor in Chicano and Chicano studies as an undergrad, and teaching me classes, materials from my own history that I had always been wanting to learn to all these questions that I had growing up in Los Angeles, I think that's where it really clicked. Oh, I can be a professor. I could teach this consciousness to our youth for them to learn about their own history, to learn about where they come from. And I think that once students have the ability to learn who they are, learn their own history, they usually do better in life. And so I think that our K through 12 oftentimes does not offer that. And so for me, it was having good mentors that showed me the way that what the value of education is, but what educational mentorship could be as well. And so now as a professor, one of the things that I'm most proud of is being able to mentor, support students and walk them along their own journey as well.
Definitely. So the importance of learning about your culture, what the culture tells you you should do, and making that the grounding space for you. Definitely, it's something that I noticed. But also, again, being able to see a professor of color that looks just like you, and you get motivated. Oh, if that person can do it, I should be able to do it. And I'm sure that some of those students who are Latino, Latina, Latinx, Chicanx come to you during office hours. They see you on campus at Arizona State University and just check in with you on a regular basis because, again, there is that comfort with somebody that hopefully speaks your own language and, again, looks like you. How long have you been teaching over there at ASU?
So I've been there for 4 years now. I started in fall 2020, right in the middle of pandemic, which was a hard transition. But I feel like now I've settled in and, it's been a great place to start my career, to get to know the demographic of students and the population in Arizona, which is very different in many ways than the communities where I've lived, which have been Los Angeles, like I mentioned earlier, and as well as Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I feel like I'm saying that I'm taking a tour of the Southwest.
Exactly. And the beauty, the diversity of all three of those states. Um, so let's talk about your book, Illegalize. Tell us again the significance of the title and the work that undocumented youth have been doing for a long, long time that often goes unnoticed in general in our community.
Well, I chose the title illegalized because illegality is the main framework in the book. And oftentimes, when authors or people talk about illegality, they talk about the big picture items, things like detention, deportation, the borderlands, which those are important and good to be talking about. But I also wanted to talk about illegality and at the micro level, the everyday actions, the way in which immigrant communities have to navigate their status on an everyday decision-making process. I'll give you a quick example. Having grown up undocumented in the state of California when I was growing up in the 90s and well into the 2000s, we didn't have driver's license. That came
Mhm.
much later. And so, not having a driver's license when all of my teen friends were getting their first cars and traveling and doing all these cool things, it also determined where I went to school. I could have
Mhm.
perhaps gone to different schools, but I said, no, I'm going to go to the local state school because it's the closest to me. I could take the bus there. It's most affordable, all of these things. So thinking about how illegality impacts everyday actions for people. And within undocumented youth, I wanted to capture how activists wanted to demonstrate in these forums that showed the repression in which undocumented communities are placed on by the nation state on everyday actions. And then also at the macro level with things like detention and deportation again.
Definitely. At what age did you figure out or were you told that you were undocumented?
That's something that was really open conversation with my family, with my parents. I don't think that was something that was ever hid from me. So I think at a very early age, I always grew up with that in the back of my mind. I didn't know exactly what that meant until I really became of age in high school. And again, I started seeing all my friends get their driver's
Mhm.
license, them talking about what college they were going to head out to, and thinking about my first jobs or possibility of getting a job. And so all of those things, that's when a lot of our undocumented youth hit that wall and have to face that illegality that I was mentioning here a second ago, and then make choices based on that. And so, I think that that was an open conversation with my parents, even though they were very supportive, they were very helpful. It also had to do with navigating those things and negotiating a lot of that conditions growing up as a youth.
Yes, I've had many conversations with undocumented parents who say we're not going to tell our child that they are undocumented at a young age because we don't want them to say it at the wrong time at school or in public or right. And then how it affects the mental health of those children when they want to go camping or somebody invited them to some type of activity far away and the parents are fearful of what if immigration detains my child and I cannot get them back. And again, I remember clearly going to somebody's house years and years ago because mom was afraid of telling her son, 6 foot four football player in high school who has a white girlfriend and she's driving him to school, back home, everything all the time. And she kept saying, you need to get your driver license because I'm not going to be your driver all the time, this, that, and the other. And finally, I was asked, and I remember I sat there on the couch next to him, and mom is like 20 feet away because she doesn't know how he's going to react. And I said, mijo, this is the reality. It's not that your parents don't want to give you a driver license. It's not legal in California. This is before AB 60. It's not legal in California for you to have a driver license. And I remember very clearly, right? He got upset. No, you just taking my parents' side because insurance is too expensive and this and that. Like, no. And I sat there and I said, you're undocumented, right? And it took him a couple of seconds to get it. And then tears, right? And this is a reality, as you said, how the lives of all of these individuals are affected. Well, by not having a valid Social Security, I cannot get a driver license. Where can I work? Where can I go to college? So on and so forth. And you are in Arizona. I am in California. And in California, AB 540, SB 68 have provided and continue to provide many opportunities, but not every state in this country has the same opportunities for individuals. And so at some point, the youth get tired of just not being able to succeed. And then they start taking action for themselves. They start advocating for themselves. Can you talk to us about some of that work in your book?
Yes, you said it precisely. I think it reached a boiling point in immigrant youth where they became disappointed, disillusioned, and quite honestly just frustrated with the system. So really, I start in many ways the book with looking at the DREAM Act in 2001 that was introduced, a bipartisan bill that would have given, undocumented youth a pathway to citizenship. That's also where we get this terminology of dreamer identity. And the idea was that if we get enough support for this, then we could go ahead and create this pathway. But it got introduced three times, essentially 2001, 2007, and then the last time by 2010, when it fails, Undocumented Youth said, okay, we've been working within the system, no more. We need to take action, a different course of action.
Hmm.
And in the book, that's what I call, going or shifting to direct forms of activism, which
Hmm.
include civil disobedience and, the use of the body as a form of protest. And so that started the escalation of the activism with sit-ins, with demonstrations, marches. But then eventually as well, Undocumented Youth said, we need to take our activism to the places where our undocumented communities were being criminalized.
Hmm.
Okay, where is that happening? That's happening in places like detention centers.
Yeah.
And in 2011, in chapter 2, I talk about an infiltration of a detention center that two activists, along with
Hmm.
a network of organizations, do. In 2011, when this action happened, activists, lawyers, we had an idea that there was human right violations happening inside of detention centers, but we didn't have the direct hard evidence or documentation of this. And so it took these courageous, activists to risk deportation to go inside and basically do a coordinated action where they would be documenting by recording audio
Hmm.
conversations to activists happening outside. And those were diffused or streamed online through, things like YouTube, social media. And then eventually, when the administration gets a hold of what they're doing, these activists become a bigger threat being inside of a detention center than actually being, outside, if you will. And so it took, risking and changing the course of action of activism for folks to realize what's actually happening, the human right violations that not only undocumented immigrant communities should be outraged, but U.S. citizens should be
Hmm.
outraged that their U.S. dollars are being used to dehumanize individuals in this country.
Two things that are important there. One, a lot of people erroneously believe that one morning in June of 2012, Obama woke up and said, you know what, I really love undocumented people. So I'm just going to give them a little gift called DACA. It was, as you said, this youth activism. Some of my former students would go here in San Francisco and literally lay down and in positions as if they were dead, and they would lay down and block the streets, get detained. It was a ticket they would get, a civil violation. They often would end up in court getting chastised by judge that it was just adding to his calendar more than anything, and then do it again, right? And do it again. And so, for people who are not familiar with this, it was the youth who created the need for Obama to create DACA, which is always at risk. And it was never meant to be a permanent solution. DACA ends up being similar to temporary protective status for our Salvadorian brothers, sisters, non-gender individuals, and others. But again, it's just that direct action that forced the government to do something. And now that we are going to have a Republican administration, Congress run by the Republican Party, one of the greatest concerns is that they will hire or contract with private prisons all over again to detain people. And then we go back to your second point there, which was human rights violations, right? Like, who's monitoring the people who are doing this? And so it's really important to pay attention to that. And in your book, again, I really like that example of infiltrating these spaces, and then the inverse panopticon, showing, demonstrating to the world, this is what's happening with your tax dollars.
Yes, exactly. And you're right on to say, and I mentioned it in the book, that DACA was not given. It was something that was pushed by activism. for many years. And actually, the research, the legal research that went into DACA was something that, undocumented youth and their allied lawyers said, hey, look, we researched this. This is possible. It can happen. It could be done. And so, I think that the lesson there is that undocumented youth realize that, they find these gaps in policies, but also in what's possible. And it becomes a mirror to say, one, to speak to the US society as a whole and be able to folks to understand what's really happening with immigration, but also internally, it's speaking to undocumented communities and say, if we come together and we do these type of actions, we actually can build, a precedence for being able to amplify these things. And I could tell you, one of the things that I've been mentioning in book talks that I've been doing is that, when I talk about these actions as archives or archiving these actions, I talk about my own experience as like a young person seeing these actions unfold in my lifetime and being shooken by the archive, by what I was watching and how impactful those actions were for my development and my critical consciousness to be able to say, wait, I can't stay in the shadows. I need to also be participating or adding to the support that this goes on. And of course, all activism looks different for many folks or takes different shapes.
Mhm.
And so for me, it's always been how do I, now that I'm doing the research, is letting the research being able to show that. But even in education, I've always been active with students. As a student, always organizing as well and things of that. So I think that one of the important things is when we see these actions, it has the power to speak externally to the US public in general, but also internally, to be able to do a call to action and mobilize people to come together and demand things, not only policy, but a reform of the immigration system, I would say.
Definitely. And there's so many pieces, important pieces here in your book, because you're talking about the historical record, what have people been doing, which also helps people who are just joining different movements and saying, oh, they were able to do that. How do we take it to the next level, right? Peaceful demonstrations, civil disobedience, right? It's not that they have to start from scratch. Books like yours allow people to look back, learn, and then move forward, which is very similar to, I would say, what happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s with the Chicanx movement, the African American movement, the Native American movements, where they said, you know what, we're no longer just going to sit here and take it. We're going to start moving. And it was beautiful to see people back in those days saying, you know what, maybe I should become a professor. Maybe I should become a lawyer. Maybe I should become this and that, including politicians, because they knew that there were people were needed in many different environments to be able to do this. And so here you are, somebody who at some point was undocumented, and now you are a professor at Arizona State University talking about this important work. And this is, again, your research is your contribution to the movement, while somebody else may be marching and somebody else may be making videos. Whatever the situation is, it's a collective and bringing people together. And the difference, obviously, between the 60s, 70s, 80s, and today is anybody just takes out their cell phone and they can record, they can produce, they can do whatever. And I think that that is something that is important again about your book, that you have done the job in gathering all this information, and the reader will be able to learn, especially those who are young, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, who are saying, you know what, I'm concerned. I'm a US citizen, but I'm concerned about my mom, my dad, or somebody else, maybe my friend who is undocumented. What can I do? Go to the book and again learn what you can do. So the book is called Illegalized. And again, today we have a beautiful conversation with Dr. Professor Rafael Martinez, from Arizona State University. The book Illegalize is about how undocumented youth, again, have decided that they're not going to stay quiet, they're not going to stay in the shadows, and they're going to speak their mind. And as a result of that, again, DACA is just one of the many things that they have accomplished. And yes, there is a certain level of risk. And your book talks about those pieces. And so I appreciate that you have taken the time to write the book, to do the research. And it seems like this is some of the material that you teach about at Arizona State University. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that you do there? Because maybe at some point, students who are listening say, you know what, I'm going to go take some classes from Professor Rafael Martinez.
Yes, of course. And, one of the things that went into writing the book was, as you mentioned, that it would be accessible and that it would be curriculum or pedagogical driven. And so as I've started to teach the book this first semester that I came out with my students, the way that I organize the every chapter is that I present the evidence or the archives. And then I also think of activism as performance, right? Bringing in performance study scholars. And so, when I talk about it with students or I'm doing workshops out in the community, I list out, what are the archives we're going to be analyzing? What are the actors or the organizations involved in the action? Let's do what are the issues that they were looking to address in this particular action or moment, and then what are the outcomes? And so every chapter is written with a postscript, and I did that intentionally because I wanted to show that this action led to much larger conversations. And that's the piece where I detail how undocumented youth changed the way that we talk about immigrant rights today. The example I give to the students all the time is nowadays the hashtag abolish ICE is a household term,
Mhm.
but that came out of some of these actions where people were addressing, of course, ICE and detention and deportations, but also policing in this country, right? The idea of like policing as a force and the race and racism that happens with some of these institutions in our country. And so, yeah, I think that one of that has been really helpful for students to understand like the process or the
Mhm.
logic of reading these chapters. I think, people who read the book will take that away. And also that I wanted to make it accessible for community members who read it and say, oh, we could use some of these practical lessons. One of the things I'll say kind of to end that thought is that one of the things as I've started to engage with different communities and getting the book out there, I've had undocumented students who've come up to me and say, hey, I'm of this generation, obviously a younger generation. I didn't know about these
Absolutely.
movements. I didn't know these actions. And I said, that makes me feel like, okay, well, the book is going to do that for them, of
Mhm.
course. But also some of my generation or older generation who are saying, hey, I remember that action, but I had completely forgotten about it or I hadn't thought about it for a good while. And so I think that's my contribution, like you said, is thinking about capturing these particular moments, but also people using them as lessons, if you will, as taking cue on what's possible, what can be a possibility. And obviously with the type of week that we're dealing with right now and administration change and everything, more than ever, I think it's important to take ideas and lessons from youth and centering youth and what's to come next.
That's another good point. For a lot of the time, adults want to step in and say, hey, we've been doing this long enough. Let us tell you how it's done. And then we ignore every contribution. And eventually, the youth sometimes just go and do their own thing because they are tired of somebody telling them how to do it and how it has not been successful. I mean, how many of us have been involved in different movements for a long, long time? And it wasn't until the youth came in that they forced again Obama to do DACA. Otherwise, it would never have existed. And so it's really important when I'm in the classroom and I'm teaching about migration and all of that stuff. It's interesting when we talk about 2006 HR 4437 and how we were marching. And there's always a young person who said, ooh, I don't even remember it, but my mom said that she was carrying me in her arms when she was marching to put a stop, right? Protesting peacefully to put a stop to HR 4437 on May 1st. Or other students are like, oh, I want to know more about that. And so, again, your book shares a lot of information that is very, very useful. And again, thank you for doing the research, putting it together. The book is called Illegalized Undocumented Youth Movements in the United States by Professor Rafael Martinez. Is there anything else you would like to share before we go?
I would just like encourage your listeners, your audience to take a look at the book, to learn from it. Hopefully, during these moments of transition, they find the stories to bring resilience, to bring, inspiration. And, I've stayed in touch with a lot of the activists that I write about. And, I'm always empowered when I listen to them or I see the work that they put out there, because even as I was transitioning this week and my processing of
Mhm.
everything that happened, I was looking at some of the statements that we're putting out on social media, and it was all statements of empowerment, of saying, we've dealt with very repressive administrations before. We've done this. Now more than ever, we need to come together, and also, I think that the U.S. Society as a whole is finding out the realities, if you will, of what oppressed people in the United States have been saying for a long time. Our immigrant, community, but also our oppressed, marginalized people of color, LGBTQ, queer communities who've been saying all of these repressive things have been going on. Now I think it's more than ever that we need to start listening to these voices, right? And so I hope that when people read this book, that they're able to see, some of the realities that our immigrant communities face, but also that it prompts them to do a call to action and say, I know somebody who's undocumented, a neighbor, a friend, a family member, right? What can I do?
Mhm.
Eh, I always tell people that everybody has privileges and power within their own operating, right? Some whatever they do for work, wherever community member they are, they have points of power. They're able to leverage many of those things to bring relief to many of our marginalized communities, including immigrant communities. So that's my last message, is for people to reflect and to not just stay in that reflection state, but think about what's the next steps to mobilize. And I think people are ready, and so I hope that the book brings inspiration and resilience.
Definitely. Again, you share so much in that last comment, but it's important to mention a couple of things. One, for anyone who's getting this message today via this video or audio, if you're listening on the podcast or on the radio, and you are undocumented or your family is undocumented, do not plan self-deportation. That's what they want. Do not leave the country. We've been here for many years. I know people who've been living here as undocumented for almost 50 years. And this beautiful human being approached me the other day and said, I just needed to tell you that I've been here for 40 years as undocumented. I've never told anybody, but I needed to tell it this week because of what just happened. They're like, thank you for sharing. Thank you for trusting me with that personal information. And we're going to continue to advocate for people like yourself, but you also have to advocate. So that's important. Don't leave the country. Two, if you need some tips, some guidance, some knowledge on how to succeed, there is this book, Illegalize, that is going to give you some of the background, some of the work that has been done, so that again, whether you are undocumented or whether you are a U.S. citizen, resident, whomever you are, you do not have to start from scratch in your community. A lot of information is here. And again, that way you can organize. And so read the book, buy multiple copies of the book, share them with colleagues, with coworkers, with friends, with allies, and then say, how do we organize something in our small or large community to support those who are unable to vote or unable to, again, be here legally? And with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Rafael Martinez, professor over there at Arizona State University. A beautiful book, Illegalized Undocumented Youth Movements in the United States. We invite everybody to grab a copy of the book and share a copy with anyone who needs to know this information. Thank you for your time.
Muchas gracias. Thank you.